kind of keep your, thank you, Franny. Thank you. It's good. Please keep your microphone turned off unless you want to speak. Use the chat facility. So again, that's a really good way of kind of capturing some questions, etc. We will have an opportunity to ask some questions after David's webinar at the end, so that's fine. And as I'll say now, we are recording this webinar, so we can share it on our various social platforms. So be warned of what you say and what you do. Look, a bit of an introduction to this particular HERDS group. This is the first meeting of this particular year of our assessment quality group. I think we've been active now since inception of 2016. I remember it was the HERDS conference in Perth, actually. So that's 7 years. Our membership has steadily grown to something like 3 figures. I think we're around 120 members. If you're not yet a member, please join and we'll keep you informed of kind of upcoming events. I'm the chair of the group, but obviously I don't do much of the work because that's what chairs tend to do. I'm always assisted by my deputy chair, of course, Pranit, who runs these so meticulously well. Pranit will be a bit quieter today, unfortunately, because he's lost his voice, but I'm certain he'll be active on the chat. And in fact, congratulations to Pranit, because he has recently, or relatively recently, moved institutions from QUT to UNSW and has got a promotion in that course. So well done, Pranit. Look, I'm certain you will see on the screen how you can join our particular group. And yes, we are still using Facebook as the most kind of robust way to connect with our membership. So please utilize that. In terms of what we've got plan for 2020-23, Pranit and I actually literally have coffee catch-ups. So we go to a coffee bar and we sit down and plan some of these events. So you'll see the kind of draft program up there on the screen. We obviously have David Carlos from University of Hong Kong doing reflective feedback literacy and iterative change. And then in May, a return of Hong Kong University, where we have popular demand. We've got Yuzo coming back. He did a great presentation last year, and he's again working on student identity in assessment and grading. July, of course, we have the major conference in Brisbane where we all get together, etc. And then August, we've got someone, I think it's Dr. James Wood from the UK, again, showing the breadth of our particular membership doing technology-mediated peer feedback. But there's plenty of space to add new events in there if you have any suggestions. We've tried to avoid a webinar on generative AI because everyone and their son is basically doing something in this. So once the dust is settled, I'm certain we'll have something on the impact of assessment quality. And in fact, I think today's webinar will probably touch a little bit on AI-related feedback, David. So there's probably no escape from that. Look, our primary purpose of our program is about networking, connecting, or should I say reconnecting post-COVID. And they're not really the same things. You know, network is about getting to know more people interested in assessment quality, and connecting is getting to know people and assessment quality more. So there's a bit of a breadth and a depth connection there. So what we try and do is short coffee catch-ups, get to meet some topics, new people, etc. So they last about an hour, and then we tend to have those deeper dive webinars for a couple of hours on a particular area with several presenters or panel discussions, and of course we tend to bring them together at the annual HERDS conference as well. So there's always opportunities to contribute to that draft program, post something in the chat, etc., put something on the Facebook site. We will certainly listen to our membership. That takes us nicely on to today's webinar on reflective feedback literacy and iterative change towards enhanced value in digital feedback processes. And it's a real pleasure to acquaint you with our presenter today, David Carlos, or as his photo says, Mr. David on his coffee cup. David is Professor of Educational Assessment at the University of Hong Kong, where he began, I think, back in 2005 as an Associate Professor. He's also Honorary Professor at Cradle, and we know him well in Australia. Deakin University of Australia, that's the Centre of Research in Assessment and Digital Learning with David Powell, chair of that. Look, David serves the higher education community through membership of his various editorial boards. I think he's on 5 top-ranked educational journals last time I looked. His outstanding contributions have been recognised over 10 awards, including for teaching, HDR, supervision, and research output. He is also recognised as a Principal Fellow of the Advanced HE. I think he got that in 2017, David. Another metric, and I'm always very jealous of this, is his substantial contributions he has made. I think it's something like 15,000 citations in Google Scholar. I can't quite remember what your H index is, but pretty impressive stuff. So when David states, his research is focused on learning orientated assessment in higher education, he really means it, and he's got the evidence to support it. Look, today's presentation was one of those ideas that came out from the membership last year. It's on feedback literacy. We tended to do quite a lot of work on assessment literacy, and I guess that's very much about the students' abilities to understand the purposes and processes of assessment. And then that kind of last bit, when people start to talk about students being able to accurately judge their own work. And I think that's really where student feedback literacy starts to come in. It's about an appreciation of their active role in those feedback processes, the continuous development of those capabilities and capacities, and for students to make sound judgments about their own and, of course, other students' academic work, which I think is really important in this area of academic integrity that we move in. Anyway, I've spoken enough. I'm going to hand over to David. We'll utilise your slides. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks to you and Pranny for setting this up. What I'm going to try and do is to stimulate a conversation. My understanding of the ethos of these events is conversation rather than a long presentation. And if time permits, I'm hoping to divide it into two parts. And for each part, I'll try and keep my input to 8 minutes or so. And I was hoping to talk about reflective feedback literacy along the lines of what Pranny and I organized a few months ago. And then in the last part, if time permits, to share a few ideas about some research I'm just starting in the kind of AI-generated feedback space. So the first part is a paper that has just been accepted for Heard. It was a paper that's taken me 3 or 4 years to complete. It was previously rejected by Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, and I reworked it and rethought it. And I'm going to just share a few highlights of it. It was quite a difficult project to enact because the original plan was to collect some data from interviews with teachers in Hong Kong and supplement it with interviews with teachers recognized for good feedback practice in Australia and in the UK. But for various reasons, my collaborators were not able to follow through. So I was left with a rather small sample of teachers. And then I left it for a few months, but I felt I had some interesting data. So what I decided to do is sort of try to extend the database through second interviews. So I'd interviewed these 6 teachers in different disciplines before the pandemic. Then I interviewed them again during the pandemic. I collected some document analysis, and I also interviewed the Vice President for Teaching and Learning, the instigator of this award. And I'll just share a few highlights and then open up a conversation. So one of the ideas I had in the paper was to use this term feedback regimes that I kind of invented based on Paul Trowler's work on teaching and learning regimes. I suppose one of the issues going on in my mind is change. You know, we've had a lot of literature on feedback in the last 10 or 15 years, but at the chalk face, are things changing at all? And we have this term feedback cultures, but when you talk about cultures, are you talking about micro, meso, or macro cultures? Are you talking about national cultures? So I'm floating the idea that feedback regimes that I've defined on this slide might be an alternative terminology to feedback cultures. And I'm also thinking that the conceptual apparatus that Trowler uses might also be relevant. And I welcome your views on whether feedback regimes is a way of thinking about the procedures and the routines and the assumptions underpinning feedback. In the findings to this paper, there were three main themes, and I suppose the regime angle particularly matches with the social context for feedback processes. Just briefly, a few highlights. One of the teachers talked about putting ourselves into students' shoes, and I thought this could be a good way of thinking about feedback. We don't necessarily need to agree with students, but just trying to empathize with their kind of struggles and feelings around feedback might be one way to go. Automated feedback is something we're really thinking about a lot at the moment, and the science teacher who was teaching a large class, he and his colleagues developed a question bank using an open source software, and they found they could reuse this every year. So there was a time investment in setting it up, but they could then use it every year. They tried to get the students engaged in using this system with varying degrees of success. And eventually, in the second interview, the teacher told me that he added a participation grade. I don't know how you guys feel about participation grades, pros and cons, but this was illustrative of another theme in the data that was around iterative refinements to their feedback practice. So these teachers seem to be tinkering with their practices every year. So one of the teachers really highlighted peer feedback and self-assessment, and he tried different angles in each successive iteration. And I'm speculating, and I welcome your views about whether this kind of iterative refinement is maybe even more powerful than trying something new, but I welcome your views on that. In the paper, I've coined a little new term, reflective feedback literacy, because I think this encapsulates these iterative refinements that the teachers were implementing. And I've defined it as critical engagement with previous feedback practices, particularly in the light of how students respond, and then making adjustments. And Trowler, in his book, he talked about salience, congruence, and profitability. And I changed profitability to a value, which I thought made more sense to me. So what would be value in feedback processes? Are the ways we might save time? Are the problems we are trying to solve? And I tried to argue that feedback should be not only useful for students, but it should be satisfying for teachers. And I suppose one of the things we all feel in practice is that because a lot of assignments come at the end of semester, and because we feel we need to show respect for student work, and we're maybe giving them some commentary, but it's kind of too late and the students can't do much with that kind of summative judgment. So could we either reduce it or completely scrap it? But maybe that's a provocation that I welcome your views on. So just finally, I want to just signal a couple of perspectives there. The value idea: could feedback regimes proceed in a kind of value perspective, and what would be value, what would be valuable in feedback practices? And then this idea of reflective feedback literacy. In this paper that was about teachers, reflective feedback literacy in relation to their practices, but I think it also has a dimension for students. And I have a feeling that if we could push students to reflect more on their feedback experiences, their generation of feedback, their feedback seeking, their feedback use or non-use, then this could actually be a way of stimulating their development of feedback literacy. And usually I think of feedback literacy between teachers and students as going hand in hand, and the more conversation and interplay, understanding of each other's perspectives. I'd like to stop there for the first part because I really want to hear your views and open up a conversation. So any thoughts on feedback regimes, feedback literacy, or anything else I've sketched in this brief introduction?
Well, David, what I'll do is I'll go through the chat. So one question is, yes, I was wondering about the term regimes as well. It seems more entrenched than feedback cultures, which may be more flexible and iterative, question mark. I would normally rely on Pranic for this one. Feedback regimes is an interesting choice, in my humble opinion. I think that's IMO anyway. The word regime makes me think of accountability mechanisms, managerial feudal systems, hierarchy. That's just where my brain goes with that particular work. I have a question, well, not really, more of a comment for you, David. I'm still amazed that you had a paper rejected by the Journal of Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. Happens to us all. I think something that you've spoken to before about how we design our feedback and put ourselves in the student's shoes, and I guess the classic example is think about students as partners. But I think in a previous conversation that we've had, you talked about short video snippets as being really effective feedback to students in terms of, you know, the teacher just going through a piece of their work, if it's written work or whatever, on a video, and marking it in real time and sending it back to them. We find that works really quite well, those kind of snippets as an idea. One thing that you talked about also was attendance marks, participation marks, etc. It's really interesting, and this is probably a bit away from feedback on assessment and more about survey completions or feedback on courses. But we actually tried to get this into our assessment policy by having it as a learning outcome, because attendance marks are not allowed. Participation marks are really a proxy for attendance marks. So we actually wrote a learning outcome, which is to contribute to the student learning experience of others through reflective practice of the teaching and curriculum quality of recent study. And we said assess by feedback process or engagement with assessment feedback processes and survey completion. So we actually tried to get that off the ground to get people involved in that, but that kind of hit a bit of a brick wall in the terms of what people thought was allowable under assessment policy. So those are my points. I'll have a look. Pranit, is there anything else in the chat that I have missed? Okay. Does that help?
Yeah, that's given me a full agenda. Can I have a go at some of those?
You go for it.
Yeah. Firstly, I think I would agree that feedback regimes has a slightly unpleasant sound to it. And I think that's probably the point. I think that our feedback cultures, our feedback regimes maybe are not that encouraging and not that productive. So I think it is meant, the term itself is meant to imply a kind of proceduralized, accountability-driven, compliance-driven system that potentially needs to change. And I suppose I'm trying to float an issue of how feedback regimes might evolve in a more positive direction. And I suppose I'm also suggesting that a kind of value perspective, a kind of reflection on what feedback processes are valuable, what are less valuable and compliance driven and could be scrapped or reduced, that stimulating a conversation around those things. Secondly, my articles get rejected all the time, and I think we should be very open and honest about this. And there is even a literature that says that articles that are placed in the second journal you submitted to are often better quality and more cited. And I think there's a certain amount of truth in that. I think sometimes you need, as an academic, a kind of reflection cycle over a period of months. And as I say, I struggled with this paper for nearly 4 years, and the version that was rejected didn't really work. And I fully agreed with the reviewers who rejected it. Well, I didn't fully agree with them, but I could see the arguments they were making. And the two Heard reviewers were very insightful as well as encouraging and supportive, and they encouraged me to push the feedback regimes idea further than I had in the previous version. Attendance and participation, well, I agree with the point that Simon summarized, that we should be assessing learning outcomes, and therefore therefore attendance is not a learning outcome. I've always been very skeptical about participation grades, but in my research for my book Excellence in University Assessment, I actually audited and sat in some classes where they really did try to gauge meaningful participation, either through spoken contributions or online. And I did find it energized the students, and there were interesting ideas around participation. And one teacher used a sort of short response system in writing that really energized the students and was quite interesting. So I can see both sides of the coin, but I think it's worth consideration maybe if it can be the assessment of meaningful contribution. Yeah, I think that's some responses from the first round. But any other issues that you want me to address?
Thank you. I'll have a quick look. Participation grades encourage my international students to participate more. Yes, there's a bit of a discussion about how to deal things in group work, but that's another particular one. Yeah, look, I think it's your feedback graveyards that you talk about, the things at the very end, and students are not going to engage with those. And I tend to find, it may be just us, but I think generally across the sector, students are not engaging in student feedback surveys because they come at the end and they don't see the point. No matter how often you say this is really important for the next generation of cohort coming through, they don't tend to fill them in. Whereas more pulse surveys, which occur during the weeks, are much more engaging because the students feel like you can still change, the teaching and the assessment design. We're not getting these points, you need to slow down, or we need more examples. So those tend to be better, those are iterative kind of things, as opposed to things at the very end.
There's a comment by Kate, Simon. Sorry? There's a comment by Kate in the chat.
Okay, do you want to read it out? Because I can't find it.
Just go up, scroll up.
Okay.
I mean, I think feedback from students to teachers, as Simon has just said, is particularly valuable midway through a course. And what I often recommend to our early career colleagues who are maybe teaching courses for the first time is maybe week 4 or week 5. What do you appreciate so far? Anything you're not so satisfied with? Any other comment? Any other topics you'd like to be addressed? And to start the conversation midway through the unit, and then feedback to them the next week and say, well, I'm going to try and act on your feedback in these ways. And I think this models for students feedback seeking at the right time and action on feedback. And I think that is somewhat more profitable than the kind of accountability that happens at the end. And I think sometimes we need to distinguish between feedback for enhancement and feedback for accountability, a bit like the formative summative distinction.
I'll just read Kate's comment out. Yeah, do we really want to close down conversations with students about their learning after the grade is given? At the end of a semester, it might be inconvenient, but we or colleagues may meet them again the following year. Can grade promoted conversations be valuable for both teachers and students?
Yeah, they might be, but I think sometimes it's a question of priorities, and we have limited resources, and I think we need to put our resources where we can have most impact. And the students in all my research, they always say what they want is more transparency and more guidance during the running of the unit. Things like teasing out the rubric, trying to help them understand the rubric a bit more. They usually appreciate exemplars of different levels of quality so they can see how the rubric and the criteria manifest in reality. and they would quite like to know what were the problems students had in previous years, you know, kind of advice and support in how to get a good grade for that unit, because the grade is vitally important to the students. Now, for the very motivated students, maybe some commentary afterwards can be useful, but I think for the average student, once the final grade is awarded, they're not really convinced that it can be useful for them in the subsequent years, even though from our point of view, it probably can. I think they find it difficult to transfer feedback from one unit and 1 year to another unit and another year. And maybe reflection can help that. If we were to start year 2 with, hey guys, what kind of feedback were you getting in year 1? How can you use it in this course? What have previous teachers told you about your essays or your presentations, and how do you think you can improve? I think if we can sort of stimulate this reflection, because I think otherwise in their busy schedule, there's a danger that students will forget the feedback from previous years.
Do you think we compartmentalize it too much, David, as well? I mean, I remember when I was in the UK, we took this, we found out there's just not enough time in the course of a subject or a unit to scaffold all that together. We actually merged units, so there were year-long units. So, you know, there were formative assessments, and there were no real major summative assessments in that first semester. And by the time we got to the end, there was much more opportunity for them to understand the processes, you know, assessment and feedback. So most of the assessment was at the end part of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think program-wide approaches to assessment have some mileage, and I think sort of bigger units with a more coordinated assessment policy. But I guess these things need leadership and need commitment. But I think they're positive. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've run out of chat on that one. Do you want to continue?
Yes, I would. Thanks. So I will move on to the second part, which is based on a session we ran last night for the Consortium for Higher Education Research in Asia. And it was Yuso Neiman and myself, and it's going to be sort of floating some ideas in the brave new world of ChatGPT and AI-generated feedback. But I'd like to start with assessment that is so critical for the development of feedback processes. So my first proposition is, are there some adjustments we could make to assessment that are positive in their own right and also cater for the realities of the AI era? And my idea is now a good time to tackle assessment overload. I mean, I think this has been with us for 15 years or so, and at certain periods of the semester, I think students just have so many deadlines and so many assignments to complete. They may be having childcare responsibilities, part-time jobs, many commitments. And does assessment overload contribute to suboptimal learning outcomes, or in worst case scenarios, various forms of malpractice, including contract cheating? So the point I'm trying to make is that probably we need to create a bit of time and space for some of the possibilities set up by AI. Process as much as product being one of them that a number of people have been talking about in the last couple of months. And then I'm wondering whether also now is a suitable time to expand oral assessment, digital oral assessment such as podcasts, vlogs, etc. So I think students generally find these kind of assessments more authentic. I think they potentially generate more incisive learning outcomes, more commitment from students. I think students often find them more interesting. And I think these are relatively less susceptible to forms of cheating or malpractice than written products are. So that's one little provocation, maybe around changes we can make to assessment. But in the next few minutes, I'll try and also sketch a few feedback possibilities. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges for feedback is always what to do in large classes, how to generate impact and uptake, and then how to support lower achieving students. And I'm wondering whether ChatGPT and its prototypes and forerunners can help the lower achieving students, because presumably the so-called silly question might be easier to ask to a bot than it is to a teacher or a peer. But I guess there's going to be a lot of challenges around AI generated feedback, in that even our initial engagement with ChatGPT has suggested to us that obviously we need to be quite critical, that it often invents things, invents references, invents articles. And I suppose for the less polished learners, there's a danger that they may be over-reliant on bots to kind of structure their writing or to sort of get them going. So in the last few months, I've been working up a project proposal for internal funding, and I've got 3 collaborators in education, medicine, and science who've been using automated feedback in their previous practices. They're all teaching large classes, and the idea is to try to develop an interface between automated feedback practice and good feedback principles. The good feedback principles that I'm hoping I can kind of provide, and the practices that they are working on and are specialists in. And then I suppose we want to try and tap into the kind of cognitive, behavioral, and affective responses of the students. And I guess working towards principled uptake of AI generated inputs. So it's not just following what the bot has suggested, but it's kind of critically engaging with it, making sense of it, and trying to use it in productive ways. And then I'm guessing that the bot isn't going to inspire you and motivate you that much, but maybe it can reduce some of the emotional barriers to raising these so-called silly questions. And the learning analytics literature has already made some starts in that area. And then building on the very good work of the Connected Intelligence Centre in University of Sydney, Simon Buckingham and colleagues, what are the automated feedback literacies that students and teachers need for principled use of AI-generated feedback? And the next slides are a few speculations from me. So I'm suggesting that from the student point of view, one of the critical factors is going to be critical engagement with AI inputs. And I'm guessing that we were going to need to scaffold that and model that and support students in this critical engagement, because obviously we can't necessarily take AI inputs at face value. And there are useful trends in both the feedback literature and the learning analytics literature that feedback for self-regulation is a critical factor in this. So to what extent can we continue to coach and model and support students in self-regulation? And then linking back to the first part, the ideas around reflective feedback literacy, that as well as teachers reflecting on previous experiences with feedback, the students reflecting on their generation of feedback, their use of feedback. seems that the kind of prompts you give ChatGPT are some of the critical issues, and how you make sense of whatever data you're getting in reply to your prompts, and then continually refining the prompts. And then from the teacher point of view, do we need to try to maybe model in the whole class context some of our prompts that we're using with ChatGPT, etc.? Do we need to try to sort of coach the students iteratively in good use of ChatGPT and its parallels? And then how can we motivate and incentivize appropriate and ethical use of AI? So I've got some questions, but I obviously haven't got the answers at this stage, and I'd be welcoming any guidance from you wise folks in the room. So just to sum up the second part, I'm kind of thinking that in the automated feedback space, and I'm using automated feedback as a kind of catch-all for any form of AI-generated feedback inputs, that maybe a way forward could be the development and enactment of pedagogic and feedback principles. So this kind of interface of AI-generated feedback and what we know about good feedback. The critical engagement, I think I've signaled as a big issue. And then tying it back in with the reflective feedback literacy, both for teachers and for students. So that's my second little provocation, and look forward to continuing the conversation in a similar way.
Thanks, David. I'll have a look at the chat in a minute. I made a couple of notes just on what you have said. Yeah, it's interesting what you say about ChatGPT. Ask the silly questions to the bot. I have to say that all the work we do with ChatGPT, they give very convincing wrong answers as far as I can see. So I don't know how that might help, but it's an interesting conversation. I'm certain, with machine learning, it's going to get better. But sometimes I read those ones and go, wow, this sounds really good, but it's actually wrong. But anyway, I think sometimes when you think about, automated feedback and feedback from students, slightly different. I want to just call out some of the work I think it's Danny Liu and Adam Bridgman at UCID have done in the SRES, which I think is a student retention engagement system. And it's a bit of a CRM, but it gives bespoke feedback to students, really takes the cognitive load off staff. I think that's a really interesting kind of program that they've scaled up across the board. So, you could look at somebody who's performing really well in their assessments, in their engagement activities and the LMS, and then they start to drop off, and it picks that up and writes a bespoke email. Well, so it kind of does that evaluation thing, and of course it allows the teacher then to focus on the students who really need a lot more support. So it kind of gives you that kind of narrative. And I think the other thing I think about a few years back, the Decongenie, which is an AI support kind of system to remind students of upcoming assessments, and would you like to join this PASS group to learn of to support you in this particular journey. So I can think of some of those things, but it's early days I think for AI at the moment, but I'm certain it will be a great help factor. I'm going to go back to the chat. I'm apparently looking at, there's a big scroll. I agree about the potential of ChatGPT for support for lower achieving students because it can provide many examples of concepts being studied, and at the same time, sorry, the big question mark that came over, at the same time that suits them, e.g. for ESL students, prompt ChatGPT for passages about a relevant topic while they are sitting on public transport. So I guess it's that kind of engagement thing. Prompt design is definitely also a skill. Sorry, I'm going through this. Would be interesting to establish who will act as an authority in establishing what counts and what doesn't count as AI literacy. Interesting. I certainly don't consider myself qualified. That's a good point. We're always talking about various assessment literacies, feedback literacies, and now there's AI literacy. How would assessments in higher education change due to ChatGPT? Now, that's a question for everybody. And then, of course, we're only on, 3 at the moment. GPT-4 generates correct references and about 40% more accurate. And of course, yes, that's very much a movement towards more and more accuracy AI. But if anyone else has got a question they want to talk about, you can please unmute yourself. We'll take those. Anyone else for David? They're all very shy today, David.
Yeah, let's have some voice from the floor.
Yes, I've done enough talking. Susie.
Susie.
Hi, David. Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Nate. I was just wondering, David, what you thought about students trusting AI feedback, how they're going to relate to it.
Well, I'm wondering whether it could be modeled in class, you know, whether the teacher could display a prompt, a ChatGPT and the answer, and then it could be discussed in pairs, and then the teacher could give their commentary. I mean, I think all of us have tried it out and find that it seems to be better at some things and less good at other things. And maybe it's easier for us to judge than it is for some students. So I would have thought having a conversation around that would be a starter.
Yes, I was going to say, I recently did that with a group of PhD students because they were quite interested in it. And I demonstrated to them how it can be used in conversation to create research questions. And, you know, how you and the AI work together and how you have to use your skills as the researcher, you know, to apply the theoretical framework or the lens you're looking for or whatever. And they were very appreciative of the ability to be able to see how things change depending on how you ask the question and what are the sorts of things that you should evaluate. So I think that modeling is really important because that way they develop that AI literacy, the ability to collaborate and evaluate with the AI.
Yeah, thanks, Lynette. In another of my rejected papers recently, the reviewer had critiqued my research question. So what I did is I pasted into ChatGPT the research method section, and I said to it, what do you think would be a good research question for this? And it gave me quite a good response. That's one of the more useful responses I had from it. And I quite like what it said, but then a couple of days later, I finessed it a little bit, but yeah, thanks.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? Sorry, just trying to read through. Okay, here's one from Hong Kong University. So you talk about reflective feedback literacy, but I thought feedback itself is reflective in nature. I wrote a paper published in Active Learning in Higher Education about reflective approaches. Iterative reflection, individual reflection, and rework reflection. In the rework reflection, if we use assessment approaches such as video, audio, reflection, then students will be given a second reflection action. Interesting. It is unusual for students to record a video without relook and rethink and refine. Maybe it is back to better assessment approaches, question mark.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. I think ideally feedback should prompt some reflection, but I think in practice it often doesn't. I think we know from the feedback graveyards idea that there are a lot of feedback comments that are posted on the learning management system but are actually never opened. So obviously if they're never opened or never read, there can't be any reflection. And I think we also know that students often take a look at the grade and then they don't read any further. So I think we do need to promote and encourage reflection. And I think, Cecilia, you've done that in your own work, but I think we have more work to do. And then I think there's also the issue of sophisticated versus less sophisticated reflection. And I think maybe there's some more work to be done in scaffolding and supporting and exemplifying reflection, and maybe teachers themselves could demonstrate a reflective stance to the students in how they deal with data and evidence. So that would be a few thoughts from me.
Thanks, David. All right, can you find any other questions? There's quite a few coming in. can be programmed to release grade after the comment is open, the LMS. I think there's a lot of discussion about the LMS as being a really good system to get AI involved in. Again, because it's a very busy space, and that kind of whole issue of having students learning in subject here. So for a subject coordinator, they're very blinkered to seeing how the student is progressing in other areas. So AI can kind of synthesize that together. So I guess that moves into learning analytics and AI. Give a lecturer time constraints and being difficult with large classes to establish that relationship required for reflective feedback. Maybe AI could take the nudging scaffolding role. Okay, so again, that's some of the stuff that I think I mentioned you said have done quite a lot of work in that space, you know, just to clear the decks and get the academic to focus on what's the really important students to focus on. Not that all students aren't important, but it takes some of that cognitive load off them. Okay. And Lynette has just put something in about a video. I haven't looked at this yet, but on how ChatGPT can be used to refine research questions and their design. So we'll probably put that through as well. So that's, I guess, what you were saying there, Dave. That's quite a useful thing if it can come back and say, what's your research question? Might get some more works published quicker.
In relation to the question about how is assessment in higher education likely to change due to ChatGPT, I mean, I'm just guessing the obvious thing would be perhaps a reduction in essays, and maybe that's no harm in that. I mean, I've sketched the rationale for more digital oral assessment. Podcasts, I think, are an interesting way to go, and different elements of digital oral assessment. And I've also proposed in my opening statement that perhaps we could try and reduce assessment overload to make a bit more space, but I don't feel very optimistic that will happen, as I guess teachers may have some resistance to. I'm not sure why. I mean, what do people think? Could we reduce the quantity of assessment without any great harm?
Well, my view is for thousands of years we've been talking about over-assessing.
Yeah.
We really do this, and we don't focus the assessment at a program level. So, you know, people, according to TEXA, you know, they have to achieve the program learning outcomes, not the individual subject learning outcomes. So we tend to over-assess because we fragment it all the time up. I mean, that's the big issue. I go back to my degree, and, you know, mine was 5 exams at the end of the whole course. There was no assessment throughout the rest of it. You know, you did finals, and that was it.
Jan wants to say something.
Jan, you want to say something? Please step in.
Oh, okay. Just a few comments. I agree that people shouldn't over-assess. I have found a problem where I've worked for over 20 years. Some teachers seem to approach it as though their subject is the only subject the student's doing, and they assess them, you know, too much. I'm a maths teacher, and I keep the assessments to a minimum, and instead of doing some of the quizzes, I would do group work instead. So try to make it as interesting as possible. Another thing, I thought it was funny, Simon, how you said about you think there's enough ChatGPT stuff going around lately. I'm at the point where I don't know if I'd bother going to another one. But I went to one really good one that one of my colleagues did. I just wanted to read a couple of quick points out. He had 20 ways to use ChatGPT in the classroom. Some of them were from the learner's point of view. So, for example, he's got here, use it to remix student work. So take 2 pieces of, I was thinking even in terms of, say, primary students or secondary students, take a poem that each child has written, put them into it and see what comes out. And I thought that could be a bit of fun and generate discussion. It also suggests summarizing texts. Now, I think that as long as a person knows how to summarize a text, so they do have the skill to summarize texts, I think that why make them continue to summarize things just for the sake of it? If ChatGPT can do it, why not get it to do it? And one other fascinating thing was in the examples that were given by a colleague, it asked ChatGPT to write a book outline with chapter headings. So it had chapter 1, introduction, blah, blah, blah. And then it put that in quotation marks and it said, now write a book based on the outline. So then it wrote a whole book about it. And it was about research and stuff like that. And I'm a PhD student, and it matched up quite well with a lot of stuff that I've read about research and methodologies. And then finally, it took the last prompt, and it said, now write a book outline. So if you want to publicize your book. So in a matter of minutes, you had your book outline, your book, and how to promote the book. So I thought that was fascinating. Yeah, nothing to do with assessment. Sorry about that.
Did they publish it though? That's the question. Did they publish it? Gosh, yes, there's a lot of power in that. Okay, there are a couple of other questions kind of coming in. Kate again. Do you think there is a danger, question mark, that students will start to see AI feedback as more defensible or trusted or personal, then personal, and teacher assessment as less reliable as it may be swayed by personality or individual preferences? That's an interesting one. Yeah.
I guess I would see the main benefits of ChatGPT feedback is that you can get it immediately and you can get what you ask for. So obviously there is a skill in what you ask for, but I think the immediacy of it is quite powerful. And I think this is one of the problems with general feedback practice is that if you submit an assignment at the end of the semester, you often have to wait for a number of weeks. And then students often tell me they've kind of forgotten about it or they don't care anymore. So I think the immediacy is a power, but as we've indicated, you need the critical evaluation skills to be able to judge. And that is something that is an open question, I suppose, and not that easy.
I'll keep on going. There's a couple more. Yeah, I read an interesting feedback. No, done that one, doesn't it? Lots of positive feedback in here. No. We don't have another question, David. Sorry, I thought there's a lot of people thanking for various links. I don't have. Is anyone from the want to put in a question who's online? I have to put in the chat. Talk it through. I often wonder, David, whether ChatGPT, when it comes really good, could help with oral assessments. As you know, the value of oral assessments is you can really focus down to what the student is. Rather than reassessing everything, you can focus down on the learning outcomes of the bits that they haven't done well. I wonder if that's going to be a role that ChatGPT can do, that you can kind of, go for a supplementary assessment against the ChatGPT kind of computer to get you through. If you're just a near miss fail that you tend to have, people are getting 48s or 45s and not quite getting through a 50% pass mark, and they've got that opportunity of a supplementary. That might be an interesting use of that kind of tool.
Yeah, seems to make sense.
We have a lot of students who just fail by a small amount, and you tend to then end up reassessing them all or sending them around for the course. It's a useful one. Okay. Oh, as I say, the research questions seem to have really taken off in here, so I won't go through all of those ones, but that looks really intriguing. Okay. All right. Franny, did we find any other questions? I think we're pretty much close. Oh, and there's another, I agree. I agree with what Susie is saying. Why force students to summarize when we have tools to help? That is how we evolve and go forward. I am concerned about ChatGPT integrating into Microsoft Word. Yeah, we've all had that nightmare recently, but never mind. PowerPoint, emails, it is already there, because at the moment, for those of us who have used ChatGPT or Gen AI, it gives us an extra step to reflect and critically analyze if AI texts are accurate, but if not. Yeah, I think we've all seen that in Microsoft Word. It'll come up with every email now. It gives you a suggestion how to respond to it. Brave new world. Okay, Pranit, do you want to summarize? And then I think we're pretty much on time.
Yeah, I think we summarized. David, did you want to say something to finish off?
Perhaps some of my takeaways are, yes, feedback regime sounds like it's got a negative connotation. I'm not sure whether I'm so worried about that, because I think part of my argument is we need to move the feedback regimes in a more positive direction by promoting a more value-based perspective on how it can help students and teachers. And yeah, thanks everybody for the comments in the chat, and sorry we couldn't address all of them. And it's been nice having a bit of a chat with you all.
Indeed, and it's quite a large membership, David. So if there's anything that you want to put to this membership at some time, you talked about, you know, having enough feedback and partners to share things through. We're quite happy to share things through this particular group, as I say.
Brilliant. Thanks.
150.
Thanks everybody.
And I say there's bound to be quite a few asynchronous people in the UK and America who couldn't join us today, so they will be there.
Sure.
So it just leaves me to thank everyone for joining today's coffee catch-up, and especially to, of course, our keynote speaker, David Carlos. Again, it's always wonderful that you can come along. As I say, we have your colleagues joining us next time.
Brilliant. Yeah.
There you go. It's promoting that kind of work. Thanks, David, and thanks for everyone joining. We'll see
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks.